I love the desert. For me, I'm born and raised in Southern California. The landscape of California, Arizona, New Mexico is fundamental. I went to Maui once, and I was completely unimpressed with the tropics. So this is a poem that I was playing a bit with that poem by Carlos Pellicer, in the same way that poets like Donald Justice play with poems by Vallejo and other poets. So Sweat. Desert winds, why did you give me hands brimming with heat? Everything I touch burns. Every palm frond becomes seared, flutters up to the sun like moths swarming over the light of a man praying in the dark. I seek somewhere so northern, my skin will turn to glass, and among the green snow pines, I will hear the wind click new consonants from icicles. Let me freeze so that twilight may gurgle faucets water cold enough to shatter teeth. Let me hear what dust doesn't register, the bubbles in coolness as water stirs awake. All the jugs of sand, all the black dogs leaping and thirsty, will crystallize into an Arctic season beneath starlight. Desert winds, why did you give me these hands full of fire?
How did you come to poetry and later to Spanish?
Questions like that are so difficult to answer. So I'll try to take it step by step. There's something about the compression of information in a poetic line or in a metaphor that I know always fascinated me. So I gravitated toward that quite easily. So I remember some of the earliest poems I discovered. Luckily, my father was a reader and a Francophile as well. So there were volumes of Ramon in English, en face translation, volumes of Baudelaire. And I remember being fascinated by A Season in Hell and by The Drunken Boat and by moments of again, compression, something being communicated, which is not entirely revealed at that moment. Borges said in his two English poems, when he talks about poetry, he talks about things half given away, half withheld. So everything is teetering between what's communicated and what's not being communicated. I also think I grew up speaking the wrong language because I grew up speaking English, but my mother is from France. So there was also the sense of seeking some voice, some other voice, some mask, some additional mask to wear. We all wear our masks. And so I became fascinated with languages. And I also think that we both grew up in a generation where there was a sudden splendor of poetry and translation. And it seems
I don't know that.
I think that in comparison to people growing up at the turn of the 20th century, for example, or in the 50s or the 40s, the ability to read lots of poetry in translation. And I think the poetry that communicated best in translation was that relied on, as Ezra Pound says in ABC of Reading, phanopoeia, the image, right? Someone like Henrik Heine doesn't translate well because for him it's the turn of phrase. But someone like Lautréamont, Rimbaud, the images are so important. Or someone like Garcia Lorca, that I gravitated toward that type of poetry. Who are the poets, by the way, that you were reading when you discovered poetry?
Well, it sounds like we have a similar origin story because I was reading Rimbaud, The Illuminations, when I was learning French in college, and Baudelaire. To me, I mean, that was magical. Just both Rimbaud and Baudelaire. You know, the Fleur du Mal, Illuminations, and I remember being in Modesto and reading the Illuminations, and when he speaks about the French countryside, I was like, well, I'm kind of there, except it's Modesto. But it's, yeah, I think for me, it was Rimbaud. It was, you're right, they're very visual. And to me, they were kind of like some visionary kind of poets.
And I find that their poetry, then it's kind of a perfect conduit to French surrealism, which also relies heavily on the image.
Mm-hmm.
And then poets who write in English that have interested me from 20th century are like Philippa Lamantia, Eugene Frumkin, or Gene Frumkin, as he called himself, who also relied on that. So it seems to be a very type of circular, easy trajectory. Paz said poetry is the secret religion of the 20th century. And I can see, I think we can bring that over.
Right.
It's a very select company, a group of people who want to read poetry, readers of poetry, it's a very slim crowd out there. But once you are in contact with this, there's the sense that something very important is occurring. That doesn't occur in the language of newspapers, doesn't occur in the language.
No, definitely not, especially today.
It doesn't occur in the language of newscasters or even of novels. So who are these other poets?
Very, very few.
Very few novels. Who are these poets that you seek?
I mean, the Mexican kind of mystical poets, or ones that are interested in some sort of numinous or spiritual kind of experience but also very modern and very today. These are not kind of backward-looking, kind of nostalgic poets. They're really writing about their time, and to me, it's connected also, I think, just to poetry in general, what it's always kind of been. Ramon Chirao, the Spanish philosopher that lived in Mexico, and he said that all poetry is sacred. All true poetry has some sort of sacred element.
I would agree, yeah.
And I think that, Rimbaud said it in his letters to a certain degree.
And Lord knows Walt Whitman was bent on that. I mean, he really spoke about really being, in a sense,
a cosmic consciousness kind of thing,
and taken over by the soul that dug into his bare, stripped heart.
It's also very sexual. Yeah, I mean, I think like,
but that goes.
I think it's kind of stuffy, but it's very sensual, very sexual. And of course, that's the tradition, especially in the Spanish.
Of course, San Juan de la Cruz, Santa Teresa
de Avila.
And by the way, going back to the Old Testament, the interpretation of the Song of Songs being that of bride and groom, of a type of cosmic union, marriage. I think that metaphor of sexual union, and then union with the word and the revelation of the poem, is fundamental. It's something that you find in all traditions, in all poetry.
No, I agree, and it's so interesting to find that kind of continuity from religious text, religious literature, liturgies of different types, and then certain 19th century poets that I love, like the symbolists, or like Baudelaire and Gérard de Nerval. That's like that's my trinity there: Baudelaire, Gérard de Nerval, and Rimbaud. But Nerval is a mystic, and then to encounter it, in different contexts, in the Mexican context, in the modern contemporary era, where poets are in Mexico City, but they're having some sort of visionary experience as they're driving a car. I'm thinking of a poem by Veronica Volkov called God, where it's basically she's driving in Mexico City, but she's having an experience of God, or her poems about, the tarot cards. I find it fascinating. And Gloria Orozco, I've been reading, the Argentinian poet, who wrote a book about her cat, or her poems to her cat. because she believed that her cat had magical powers.
Was it kind of like Christopher Smart or very different?
I'm not aware of Christopher Smart.
Oh, he has a poem about his
cat.
His cat, yeah.
Well, all poets write poems about cats.
Of course. Some of the best are about William Carlos Williams. There's that beautiful poem about
I forgot about his.
The cat descending from one flower pot to another. And then, of course, the cat reappearing in poems by Baudelaire.
Baudelaire, Borges, Edgar Allan Poe, of course. Just about every great poet has a poem about a cat. The title is Chapala in early August. Chapala refers to the lake in Jalisco near Guadalajara, where D.H. Lawrence actually lived there for a bit. And there's a beautiful hotel there that is where he lived. I wrote it there on a day that I was reading Vallejo. And so it's entitled Chapala in early August. A day to read Vallejo, nothing more. The lake under an ancient spell, blessed and mild, the rhythmic glare of its waters, but nothing in relation to my soul. Forgive me, daylight perfection, for being so neglectful. I want to be alone, although it hurts to the bottom of my childhood. The world distances itself, takes humanity along. It is not self-pity to think that love and tenderness have been orphaned, that poets are the capricious children of the world's wounded parents. But who are they, those parents who didn't make a place for us in our skin, in their love, in those warring political parties of the spirit, parental figures? All those lovers who never loved or only feigned affection, authority figures of nocturnal hours. An evil leak in the vessels of lineages made us descendants. The hours of a beautiful day trickle along, and I look forward to the night, its death song of indifference. The pregnant night awaits in the holy, dark lap of summer, bloated with the immaculate conception of morning. In urchin morning light will again be born, deformed and beautiful, revered like ancient lions.
Beautiful. Holy dark lap of summer.
I felt like I was channeling Vallejo that day.
The holy dark lap of summer reminds me of something that maybe Hart Crane would write.
I like Hart.
It's kind of this juxtaposition of words that you're not expecting.
I was staying in this place where I had a view of the lake.
Yeah.
It's funny I didn't think, probably a good thing I didn't think of Hart Crane and water. But I just was thinking about the lake, and then at the you can actually take a little boat on Chapala, and there was a little island. And I don't know, it was a very interesting kind of morning, and I was very sad. I didn't know why. I just had a great time in Mexico, and I was like, oh, I don't know why I'm so sad today. And it was like so gorgeous, and I thought, oh,
must be the water. It's a lake.
Must be the water or something.
There's a whole tradition in Nicaragua, where they call it Mar Dulce, the giant lake. Jose Coronel Urtecho and Cuadra have these poems. It's a whole tradition of poems celebrating this vast, immense lake and how it's so different from when you're on shore. Yes, it's something about the water that draws up the blood for inspiration.
You're not only a poet, you're very accomplished and prolific translator. And you have translated a diverse list of Latin American poets, including the queer modernist poet Salvador Novo. With David Shook.
With David Shook, yeah.
The Tijuana poets Roberto Castillo Udiarte and Jorge Ortega were
wonderful
poets.
Ortega's from Mexicali.
Oh, he's from Mexicali. Okay.
Yeah. If you tell someone from Mexicali they're from Tijuana, then it's just it's going to be a major issue.
Okay.
It's like telling someone from San Francisco you're from Stockton.
Okay.
God forbid.
Yeah. Big difference. the Mexican mystic poet, Enriqueta Ochoa.
Yeah.
And you also rescued from complete obscurity
Facundo Bernal.
Facundo Bernal,
Yeah.
who's an early 20th century Mexican border
From Mexicali.
writer.
Yeah, and I would say
So,
he's the first. Facundo Bernal, I think, is the first poet from the border region, and also the first poet to really write with the vernacular of the border. In his poems, he includes words and terms that would be now included in Caló.
Right, precede the Pachuco,
Yeah,
of
Pachuco,
the Mexican American.
I mean, there's a poem, for example, where he uses the word bichi, which in northern Mexico means naked.
Right.
And he also incorporates other words from English. So he was a very interesting poet. I thought get greater enthusiasm among readership, but then again,
It should have.
But it's, poetry.
With all the introductions that it had in the book, by Larb too. I thought it was very interesting. I of course I'd never heard of him. No one had.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean it was kind of an early border literature, what became known as border literature, like what 50 years later. Or
I would say in Mexico there's very much now literature from the north is popular. They call it literature from the desert. Or border literature, the noir fiction. My wife, Nilsa Martinez, writes short stories very much in that style. But I would say the first pieces of border literature were Facundo Bernal with Palos de Ciego, and then a novel from Tijuana called Tijuana Inn, which kind of created this whole myth of the border as a nefarious space of a space of lewdness and et cetera, and violence.
And then you also just translated Rodolfo Ginostroza, the great Peruvian
wonderful
poet.
Yeah.
It's the first English translation.
First English translation of the book Contra Natura, which won the Mandorla Prize in 1971.
Selected by Octavio Paz.
Paz was the judge.
I read the manuscript. Obviously, it just came out by Cardboard House.
Cardboard House Press, yeah.
Cardboard House Press. I think we have a copy here. We can.
You liked it?
Plug it. Yeah, it's great. And it's a great cover.
It's that's how the
original.
Yeah, the original was smaller, but the same cover.
So great introduction also that you wrote for it. I'm interested in how you choose which poets to translate, because there's so much, and I see no kind of rhyme or reason, except that they're all very interesting poets.
I would say
very, very different. And Salvador Novo and Castillo, I mean, very different.
Entirely, yeah.
And I think that's just kind of, I think that's very interesting in and of itself. It doesn't have like a profile. So do you have a certain thing that you look for? Have you done anything consciously, or just in terms of who you choose to translate?
No, it's kind of like going into a thrift shop, and you're looking at all these things that people have been collecting.
Or discarded.
Or discarded, and someone like...
you wonder why.
And why. And Novo has not appeared in any anthologies of Latin American poetry recently.
Really?
Yeah, there's one volume that Penguin did in the 1960s. They included one poem, which is the poem Epifania, which is one poem that's haunted me. And I just felt this urge, this obligation to present him. For example, there's this, now I'm going to be like plugging something. This is a poem by Tomás Hernández Franco named Yelida, which is a long narrative poem. He's a Dominican poet. And no one knows about Dominican poetry at all. There's just no interest, really. There's an interest in some of the recent novelists who are Dominican American, but no one really reads Dominican poetry. And so I've been mesmerized by what I've been reading that comes from the Dominican Republic.
Because even in the Latin American poetry anthologies, they're translated into English
Yeah.
here or in the UK. I can't think of any Dominican poets.
Recently, it's been Pedro Mir, who's been, but that's it. And Salvador Novo never appears.
That surprises me because he was very modern for some. He was openly gay in the 1920s, right?
Yeah.
Very much part of the literary scene, connected with the contemporaneos, right?
Yeah,
The
he was one of the key members.
Group of poets in Mexico City.
Jorge Cuesta, Villarrutia, Jose Gorostiza, Salvador Novo, and
the most out and queer. So you would think he would fit more with current taste or sort of. I wonder why.
Well, he is still read in Mexico, so it's not as if he's forgotten there. But it's just he's never. Again, I don't know why he hasn't reached a wider readership. He should.
There's all these things that I think go into poetry and language are not so obvious. You know, like even a different language. You know, how. Having access to a different language just opens up another world inside of you that doesn't exist.
I find myself appraising words from one language to another. So which one best captures the noun or the adjective? You know, corazón or heart. You know, it's interesting when you think about it. And then also the words that, don't appear precisely in one language or appears in another. That sense of, in Spanish, there's one word for loneliness, isolation, and solitude, where in English we have isolation, solitude, loneliness. Very interesting.
That's why translation is an art. It's also a form of writing poetry.
Well, it's part of our canon.
In what sense?
So many of the works of poetry that we take for granted as being written in English are translations. For example, the sonnets by Sir Thomas Wyatt are translations from Cavalcanti and from Petrarch. The poems like The Seafarer by Ezra Pound, a translation from Anglo-Saxon. Old Testament, we don't read that as translation. We just consider it's part of English. I mean, the amount...
And how much the King James Bible has influenced English.
Exactly.
The English canon.
In 20th century American poetry and recent poetry, there are people like Will Alexander, or there's people like Kenneth Rexroth. I really sense a sense of this, again, union, spiritual seeking with Rexroth, with his poems of nature. But there's a lot of poetry that's the product of MFA workshops, where it's almost as if you can see the formula, the recipe that they're teaching. It's usually a poem written in first person, written in language that is accessible to the ordinary reader. Usually ends with a type of, I didn't think about it that way, a type of zing or a little revelation at the end. And I'm really disturbed by this type of poetry because it's
But you have an MFA, right?
I do.
And see, I don't, so I don't know what to say.
There you go. Wow.
Except that, I mean, I've only been in workshops a few times, and I thought what was odd to me is how much the other participants, which were mostly, I think, MFA students, or like they're really into rules.
Yeah.
Like I felt like I was back in church. Like
suddenly
there's things you do and things you don't, and there's like a war against adjectives, and it's all verbs, and then everybody spoke about just contemporary poets, and from the U.S. So I felt it was very kind of limited, but not the instructors that I took just for
then you are
few
lucky.
times. Oh, really?
Yeah. Perhaps the worst culprit was an instructor who told me that if a student presents a poem which he thinks his grandmother wouldn't understand, then it's not worth reading. It has to be
Wow, that's a weird rule.
By the way, whose grandmother? Because
Well, yeah, I think
my grandmother was very well read.